All right. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Not sure whether you can hear me. All right. Amazing. That you can hear me on the chat. We are waiting for a minute for Naomi that have some technical difficulties, but if she couldn't make it, then we will start and I will take the role of the moderator. So 30 seconds, we are trying to solve it. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so I think we will start and Naomi will join us later. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar. We are really glad you are here. We have an awesome amount of participants. We are in 250, so we are happy that this subject is very close to your heart. We have Roger here, which will introduce himself in a few minutes, but we are really happy to announce this partnership between Bob and Mercer, and to show you a bit what this partnership can benefit you and how can you use it, and to discuss a bit about, in high level, about the trends that goes on in the market regarding compensation and benchmarking data. So I say thank you. We're really glad you are here. And I think let's start from a small introduction. So hi, my name is Tomer. I'm a senior product manager at Bob. I'm responsible for the compensation, the benchmarking data, and the job catalog. And I will be moderating this event until Naomi can join us. Roger, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. And hello, everybody. My name is Roger Sturdivant. I'm the product leader for a product called Mercer Comtrix. It's a high technology global salary survey that also includes a wide variety of workforce metrics. It's a product that we started just over 10 years ago, and we sold it to Mercer in 2015. And I think at the time we sold it, we had about 170 participants, and now we're up to about 1,000 customers. So it's been a great run. And, again, it's focused mostly on high technology companies as participants, but more and more what we're realizing and what's happening is that even more traditional companies are realizing that the difference that you can make from an innovation standpoint is related to technology. And so we have a lot of participants and people involved that are not typical technology companies. So it's been great growth, and I look forward to talking to you today about some of the trends we see in compensation. That was my beginnings were as a compensation manager for a healthcare company here in the US. And so I'm happy to talk to you about things I see in the compensation world.
Amazing. So I think we'll take this opportunity to take a deep breath and to discuss a bit on a very high level about the trends that goes on in compensation. I think all of us seen a lot of changes in the last 2 to 3 years. The norms that we were used to are changing one by one. And I would like to ask Roger, what do you think are the biggest trends that we see in compensation in recent years, specifically last year, because we know that there are a lot of changes?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost kind of like where do you begin? I mean, we can always talk about the mechanics of the process and how people do compensation planning. We can talk about that. But what I would say that I've seen is probably the biggest change and it's not going to be news to anyone. But from a compensation perspective, it does have challenges. But that's the globalization of just the workforce. What we've found is that employees can be very productive working out of their homes. And if you are an organization that maybe has their headquarters in a place like Silicon Valley or Geneva, Switzerland, where labor is really expensive, then you kind of realize that you could have someone work virtually from places like Albany, New York, or Lithuania, lots of different countries where skill sets are equivalent, but perhaps costs are dramatically lower. And this is something that it's not stopping. We're going to continue to see this trend. And what was interesting in some of the data we looked at last year was that while we saw that wages were starting to increase, we kind of heard about this, that what we saw was the salaries or even total compensation packages being paid to technical employees in particular. For newly hired employees, the premium of a new hire salary was much greater in unexpected locations. I mentioned Albany, New York, but probably the location that we saw, at least in the United States, which was had the greatest sort of movement, was San Antonio, Texas. It's spillover from Austin. It's people moving from Silicon Valley, but that's just one example. Salt Lake City was very, very close behind, and even places like Idaho. So I think the diversification of the workforce from working in an office to pretty much working anywhere is the biggest thing that I've seen change, and it's going to continue to change. I don't see any stopping that. So.
Yeah, you think that like in 2023 we will still see like the after effect of the COVID, that remote work became the new norm, and people can work from everywhere?
I think so. I mean, what's interesting is you read the news and you see that there are some CEOs like I guess Elon Musk comes to mind, right? When he wants everybody working in the office, and I think there's other people that believe that that's the most productive way to kind of get things done. But I don't see that happening widely. I think that the most common model that we're seeing is the hybrid model, which my guess is what many of the folks on this call have with employees. And I think that will continue. The economy certainly is playing a lot into this though right now. I think the other sort of wrinkle is what's happening in terms of companies that might be having layoffs, wage freezes. In the data that we actually ran a survey very recently looking at pay increase budgets and how it might be changing for employees. And also we looked at, we asked our participants about staffing levels. What are you looking at in the future for staffing? And what was interesting is about half said that they're going to keep staffing levels exactly the same. And although that in itself is actually a change, because even into 2021 and COVID, the vast majority of companies were still increasing their workforce. They were still adding to headcount. So the fact
like hypergrowth.
But the fact that only half are adding, only that half are keeping things the same is certainly different. Now, in terms of the other half, 2/3 are still adding to staff, and 1/3 are looking to actually reduce staff. So what's interesting is when you look at that entire picture, only 10% of the organizations are looking to reduce staff. And I say that's just one survey. We probably had 150 companies that responded to that, which is a decent turnout. But a day doesn't go by where you don't see Meta laying off a whole bunch of people, Microsoft having a wage freeze, and Amazon just, I think yesterday, announced that they're going to have a reduction in force. So I think the big takeaway is that there's a lot of unknowns, and it's going to depend, I think, on different businesses. So certainly companies that make a lot of money by online advertising, that's been taking a bit of a hit. So I think it really depends on, every organization is going to be different, and I'm definitely a person that believes that no matter what data comes out, whether it's what other companies are doing in terms of staffing levels, that it really comes down to each individual business making decisions on what's right for them. And it may be that you're in a niche that is continuing to grow quite rapidly, and you're still hiring. And so not only might you want to hire, but you might want to hire and continue to pay your existing employees, even more. So it's very much a business decision. The one thing we all know is that workforce cost is, for most companies, the highest cost in the organization. And so everyone's very sensitive to it right now. And that's why you're seeing what you're seeing in the news. I would add just one more thing about sort of compensation planning. The other thing people ask about is, how are pay increase budgets changing from past years into going into 2023? It's the question that we get asked more than any other one. And back, say, 4 or 5 years ago, we were still, at least in the US and really Western Europe for sure, looking at very sort of miserly salary increase budgets in the 3% range, more in places, of course, like India and high growth areas, but relatively subdued. And that has changed with inflation and so forth. We've seen wage inflation, and we saw it tick up this spring. For example, in the US, it went from, say, 4% to 4.7%. And in our most recent study that we literally just published yesterday, we see the US at 5.3%. So, 5.3% compared to 3.2%, let's say, 4 years ago, that's a pretty dramatic increase. And again, though, I think we're living in a world where things are changing day by day. So despite the fact that it's 5.3%, I'm not suggesting that everyone go out there and budget 5.3%. Again, it's a business decision. It's a lot of money. Every percent that you add to wages, that's a big impact on the bottom line. So anyway.
Yes, I think you brought up some very, very good points. So first of all, regarding the trend, so it's very interesting to see that the way the market is affected is not by laying off, by massive layoffs that we can see or we can hear in the media, but it's more like a slowing down of the talent acquisition, that companies are stopping the hyper growth and are much more, I think, responsible or cautious about how many new hires will join the organization. And then the other good point was about the increase rate. What I found very interesting is, do you see any correlation between the inflation rate in some geolocations and the increase? Do you see that places that have higher inflation rate? I know it's a buzzword recently that everybody has a lot of inflation. The US, Europe, Israel. Do you see any effect on that?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's always a correlation there. I mean, if you look at a country like Argentina, I mean, it just goes crazy. India is still on the high side more so than most other countries. Yeah, it's absolutely a correlation, and I think though that as companies were still competing to get talent, they were throwing money at candidates, right? We saw in our own data that the average increase that a new hire received was something in the order of 15.6%, and that's in the US. We saw it in Europe, we saw it in Asia, we saw it in other locations as well, and that may start to taper down a little bit, but certainly there has been a correlation. Again, we're in a very volatile time right now, and so every number that I quote, I just would be very careful to say that things could change pretty dramatically. And I did see up on the chat, I haven't, as I'm talking, I can't quite read all of them, but someone said, would you be someone that would support kind of a pay increase budget that would be the same in every country across the globe? And I definitely would not support that. I mean, I would certainly be targeting a global pay increase budget that would take into account the weighting of where each organization's headcount is. That's from a budget standpoint, you might have a number that works out to 4.5%, but you absolutely have to look at doing it differently country by country. I mentioned Argentina, I mentioned India, other locations as well. So yeah, be careful of that one. But a global budget is fine. The other thing too, I'd say is, especially when you start to feel pressure, if you realize that getting top talent is still hard, but you're under cost pressures, then you start to look at decisions like, do we have differential pay increases by different types of roles? And so I absolutely think that companies will start to do that. So if the big differentiator is innovation in your company, and you need to make sure that you're hiring AI engineers, because that's the core of how your product works. Absolutely. And I think even in technology and in most areas, there's always going to be a need for commercial experts. So sales jobs are always going to be in very high demand. So
yeah, I really think that this is I get segue to our next part, which is, I think, the difference between the benchmarking data that Mercer provides, which come in percentiles, and the pay bands that each company needs to set. And those pay bands are basically HR decision and are based on the HR philosophy. And as I say, if you want to invest a lot in innovation, then you will choose higher percentiles to work with for the innovation people or for different sites. You mentioned inflation. I think Argentina is a great example. Country with hyperinflation, and the pay raises needs to align to that, because if the pay raise is not aligned to the inflation rate, then de facto employees are paying less, are getting paid less. I think that one of the other benefits of having the benchmarking data and then the Bain's data that Bob and I will show it you shortly how you can implement it within Bob, and I will share a bit about our future plans on how we can model all of this data in this entire process within Bob. But before we go into the details, and everybody are very eager to see the demo, I want to talk a bit more about why do we need those bands and why do we need this benchmarking. And I would really like to connect it to another trend that goes on in the market. And I know this is a very hot topic, but is pay visibility. And why do we need this pay visibility in order to minimize the pay gap? And more than that, what are the current trends? So I know some companies are doing it voluntarily, but in other locations, we are being forced to, or not all, the legalization, the regulation is making the companies present this data and make it visible. So what do you think the trend will be, and how the benchmarking and the band data can help us achieve that visibility and this transparency? And more than that, what are the benefits of doing this transparency to our employees?
So were you asking me that question? I'm sorry. I was going through the chat just to make sure that I would capture some of the questions for later. Okay. Well, so absolutely, that's another very interesting trend that's changed pretty dramatically in the past couple of years. So pay transparency, and I think a lot of it came from a lot of the diversity and inclusion initiatives that are going on in the world. Very, very important. And it's also just the fact that data is become salary data is become so commoditized. I mean, you can go on to salary.com, or there's all kinds of different websites you can go on to, and it will paint a picture of what you should be paid based on things that you put in, and those those apps are maybe at least a starting point to think about what you should be paid. I don't necessarily subscribe to those because, I mean, who knows what people actually put into those databases. But what I think it does do, though, is it makes pay something that is more of a discussion point than it ever was before, and being transparent about what rates are at a job level, because we can easily do that now, even down to the point of specific skills and what those skills are worth. That is important in any communication you have with employees. And I know also that as we get more and more data, salary data put into different products like ours or anything else, then again, it becomes much more of a commoditized piece of information like anything else that's out there. So if you're not going to be transparent about it, then you're always going to be sort of defending questions that people have. It's much better, I think, to publish, whether it's salary ranges, even, bands of values by a given job. There's lots of ways to do it.
And I think this visibility also gives our employees the prospect on how can they progress in the organization, and make everything much clearer in many ways. I think we can start discussing the data and how Mercer data can help companies facilitate what we just discussed about visibility and creating the bands and increasing and deciding on the pay increases. And I think it all comes down, like, if I will TDLR everything, it all comes down to trust. Once you have a trust that the pay ranges that you're giving, that you're working with, are based on the market values, it gives you the trust, I think, to make it visible, because you will not be surprised by the result. If you set your own bands based on your own personal preferences or your own guesses, then there is a risk in this act of visibility. So I think we should maybe explain a bit about the data and how it can help us and everyone reach this visibility, and then we can show you a quick demo of how you can use it within Bob. I think that could work. So Roger, would you like to explain a bit about the data?
Oh, sure. So the data that we collect, within Mercer, and that we are now sharing with HiBob, just give you a little bit of background on how we came up with that. I mentioned that we've got about 1,000 companies or so that have signed up with us, and that we're trying to get the data from all those companies into our database. That's our challenge right now, is to get all that data ingested. But still, with 500 or so in the data, and almost 5 million employee records, it spreads a very wide span of organizations. And I would say that if you look at it, that data in aggregate, it may or may not be most appropriate for organizations, particularly a lot of the organizations that might be on this call, which tend to be smaller organizations. And we do see certainly pay differences of smaller companies. So the Mercer data that we've included in Bob is a subset of the Mercer Comtrix database. And it's focused on those organizations that are kind of in the small to mid-size realm, in areas like e-commerce, software, in media and fintech. So those tend to be the hottest areas of technology right now. We don't have a lot of semiconductor jobs and so forth in the data, but that's kind of a reflection on really the Bob, I think, participant list. So we tried to cultivate out of our database a set of information that would be most appropriate for the group that we have here. And so, so what does that mean? Well, I would say this, first of all, that the size of organization doesn't always correlate with pay. It doesn't, just because you're a larger organization doesn't always mean you pay more. I mean, it tends to at the executive levels, but not at not for the typical professional level. I don't see that at all. But still, it companies always want to look at organizations that are around their size, and I think that's the data we've cultivated for you. Now, so you have all this information, you've got it now available in Bob. I guess the question then becomes, how do you use it? And Tomer, I know you're going to do a little demo on how you could use it. And still, if you're involved in compensation, or your goal is to try and set up a compensation program in your company, there's a lot of ways you can go with that. I mean, you can establish salary grades and levels and do it in a more traditional manner, or the way I like to look at things is to have maybe some general wider bands of employees, and then look at the pricing of jobs pretty directly that would fall into those salary bands. And so there's a lot of different ways you can do that, and it really becomes preference for you as an organization. I would say the more you go into salary grades and traditional salary structures, I think it's not really kind of the modern way. It doesn't really support some of the transparency that we were just talking about. So anyway.
Yeah, and I see that you have some questions about the data coverage, like geo-wise, level-wise, function-wise. So I see that you have some questions in the chat. Can you elaborate a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
and then I will go into the demo. I see that we have questions about that also.
Right. If you were to think about a typical organization and the kinds of roles, particularly as you think about more technology types of things, we reflect the market. Our goal is to collect from each of our participants all of the employees that the organization has. So it's going to be salespeople, finance people, human resources, software engineers, hardware engineers, technical support people, professional services consulting. It's the gamut of roles, and then each one of those roles is complemented by different levels in the organization, going down to support levels up through professional levels, managerial levels, and even executive levels as well.
And how many geos is the data cover?
We have I want to say it was like 70 countries we report, and within that it's going to be like over 100 different cities, actually like 150 different cities within those countries. So yeah, and it's not to say that again we reflect the market. So if you're looking for a machine learning engineer in Bucharest, Romania, we might have that, but we may not, just because there just might not be a lot of people in Bucharest that have that. And so the question is, well, what do I do then? Well, what I would suggest is that you look at maybe software engineering as a starting point. Compensation, what I've learned in my time doing this is, as much as it seems very scientific because we're dealing with like specific numbers, there's a little bit of art involved in it as well. And so, if you typically see where you have a location that does have, machine learning and software, and you see it's an 8% difference or something, then you sometimes you have to use that as a way to approximate what levels could be. So yeah, that there's always going to be situations where people say, well, I really need to. We're hiring our first engineer in an area that's not very, very popular, and every organization kind of faces that. So you deal with the data you have, and you kind of interpolate along the way. Very scientific.
And I think that's first of all, I think everything we do is like semi-scientific and semi-artistic in a way. I think it's a description that is very relevant to many tech positions in the industry currently. But I think it's a very valid point that not always that the Mercer data reflects the market, and not always you will have the specific data points that you need. But the data is arranged in a hierarchy manner, so you can always go one level higher in the hierarchy and catch a wider range. I think this is the best way. I think let's jump into the demo. I think that's the big step that everybody are waiting for. So let me share my screen. And please let me know in the chat whether you can see my screen. Can you see it? Yes.
It's coming to life.
It's coming to life.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, amazing. So within the new job catalog that we just released, which is the place that you can model the jobs of the HR organization the way that HR organizations see them, unlike the job titles, which are more like the job display names. You have the three dotted here that you can export the benchmarking data. And you can see that you will have this light box. And here you can choose which portion of the Mercer dataset that Roger mentioned you want to download to your computer. The full dataset, you can download it, but it's huge. It's tens of thousands of records. So what we would suggest is for you to select the relevant functions that you want to use. For example, I chose all here. The relevant levels. So there is a question on the chat about higher levels. So those are all part of the data. So if, for example, I chose to work on those 4 levels. And the last thing is the geolocations. As Roger mentioned, we have the country, but we also have city level as well. So again, it's very recommended to minimize the amount of initial rows that you are working with. It will make your job easier later on. So this is the basic of how you can access the data from within Bob. Now I will share with you a bit how to use it later on. I will start by saying 2 things. First of all, this webinar is recorded, so you don't have to follow every step and write it down. You can always look back at the recording. Second thing, we will release a video that will explain everything that I'm explaining right now in a very simple manner. And the last thing is what I'm showing right now is the solution and the method until we will release the next part of the process, which is how to model the bands within Bob. What I will currently show you is how to use Excel and how to use several VLOOKUPs in order to match the data from Mercer to your employees in your employee directory in Bob, and then upload it into the compensation event that you're using. Then I will explain a bit about our future plans. So I think let's start with the method. So first you export the file. I already exported here, and you can see an example file with the geos, the functions, and the levels, the relevant levels. And to the right, you can see the percentiles. This is obviously demo data that is just entered, but you can see the different percentiles for base salary and also the different percentiles for the total cash as well, for the total reward. The next thing we need to do is to create one index field that we can compare everything to, which is basically to combine the function, the level, and the geosite all into one line using concatenate. You can see here. Once we did that, we need to create 3 indexes that will match our data in Bob to the Mercer codes that exist in the Mercer data. So first we need to match the Bob sites that we currently have into specific geos that Mercer has in the data. We can select to match it to a specific city, or as Roger mentioned, to the entire country. Even though we have granular data on New York, we may choose that you want to have one benchmarking data or one band for all of the sites in the US. The next index we need to create is the job names that we have in our job catalog within Bob to the Mercer job codes that are relevant to this job. If you've done this process before, it's a bit of a manual work, but it's a work that needs to be done once. And as I mentioned, in the future, we will help you do this process within Bob, not outside in Excel. But we don't want to leave you hanging, and we know the value is very urgent. This is why we release it in this version, so you can start using it right away. The last index we need to create is between the levels that we have in the job catalog. So in the job catalog, each job, for example, product manager, we can connect many levels to. So for example, I'm a senior product manager, my director is a director of product management, and my VP is a VP of product management. All of us are connected to the same job, but to different levels. So we need to match those levels into the Mercer level code that we just downloaded. Once we did all that, we can go to the employee directory within Bob and export our directory with 3 relevant attributes: the email, the job of the employee, and the site of the employee. Because we need those, basically we need the job and the site to match them to the Mercer data. So we take the job, we need to split it because in Bob it comes together with the level. And then we need to do a VLOOKUP to the indexes we just created for each one of the fields and connect them. this connection will help us to have this concatenated field assigned to a specific employee. And then we need to create a VLOOKUP of this field to the field we concatenated in the Mercer data. This will help us get the relevant benchmarking data over here. And then we can set the bands. As we said earlier, the Mercer data is in percentiles. So we have the 10 percentile, the 20 percentiles, etc. But the band data, the pay bands are a minimum value, a mid value, and a maximum value. And we can set those values over here just by selecting the different rows in the index of the Mercer data. So for example, 16 in this VLOOKUP, I think it's the 10, it's the 20 percentile over here. And then we can adjust it as necessary. I will pause for a second and say that, as we mentioned earlier, those decisions regarding the pay bands are a company decision, are depending on your philosophy and your recruitment needs. So if, for example, for a DevOps engineer, I want to have a higher pay bands, then I will select a higher percentile, let's say, for example, and it will increase it will increase the minimum value of the band, the max value, and the mid value. Please also note, don't forget to also do a VLOOKUP to the currency. Each one of the records in the Mercer data using the local currency depending on the geo. So please also note to do a VLOOKUP for the Mercer data, for the currency data of each line. Once we did that, we can go back into our compensation event. For example, I have a test event over here. And the same way that we're doing it right now, enable the benchmarking data and export the file we just did and add the file over here. This will allow us to see all of the relevant information regarding this employee. So first of all, we will see the minimum and the mid and the max value of the benchmarking. And more than that, and based on the mid value, we will also calculate the comp ratio of each employee or the position of the range positioning. Depending on the method you are working, the comp ratio is relative to the mid value, while the position ranging is relative to the min and the max. So it will be shown inside of the event and will help your managers and your planners to understand how each employee is relative to the bands that were set by the company. And again, it's another decision helping tool on how much increase, merit increase, this employee will get in the upcoming cycle, because maybe a 5% increase will still keep the comp ratio of this employee very low, so we need to compensate him a bit more. This is in a very short view how the data is currently being shown in Bob. As I said, we are planning very big things in this regard. The first thing that is going to be released very soon is the ability to view and to model the bands themselves within Bob. So the band will be a calculation, a combination of the job, the level, and the site. And instead of doing this in Excel, it will be inside of Bob, and it will be automatically connected to the event. So that's a bit about how it looks within Bob. I will go through the questions to see if there is anything that I forgot about mentioning. So I think, Roger, I can see a lot of questions regarding the amount of data points regarding geos. So can you elaborate a bit about that also?
London. Yes. So in terms of the number of geos you're saying, or
number of geos and the coverage, I think we see a bit more questions about that. So maybe it's worth elaborating.
Yeah, it's like it's 156 cities within 75 countries that we would have data for, and obviously we have more cities within the larger locations, and so the larger locations being US, UK, India, China, and then any of the Western European countries, we'd have multiple cities included. And again, if there are going to be situations where there might not be enough data at the city level, and again, this is where the sort of art of compensation comes in again, where you can look at some jobs where there is lots of data between, let's say, the UK and Thames Valley, where you can see that there's a 7% difference, and then sometimes you might want to apply that differential to the the country level if that's all that might be available. I think I also saw a question about what about people that have specific skills, particularly cybersecurity, and we actually have a couple of different jobs in the cyberspace that are within software as well as within IT. We also have a fraud role within the web e-commerce space as well. So that's one that we actually cover because there's a unique skill set there. There are going to be certainly roles that you've got where you're looking at maybe a front-end developer with Web 3.0 skills, right? Well, so those can be that's a little trickier to benchmark because not every company has that exact role. But again, it's something that is what we do is we reflect the market. So as we see that organizations have new and different jobs that become solidified, then we start to add them into our library, and then we'd have data for those specifically as well.
Yeah. I think we have some time for questions. So if anyone has a question that we didn't answer in the chat or want to ask something new, I think that's the time, and we will be happy to answer, whether it's about the data, whether it's about the plans that we have in Bob. I saw that there are a bit questions about how to make this data available. So this is a paid add-on. So if you want to add it to your account, please contact customer support and work with them, and they will be happy to add it to your account and to give you a further guidance if needed. So anyone has any question?
There was one question that I just wanted to comment on. I think one person asked about equity or long-term incentives, and have there been any recent changes in that? And I think what was interesting is that as much as base salaries we're growing at a fairly modest rate 3 or 4 years ago, long-term incentives that was different, especially in the US. We saw that and globally as well, that the value of the long-term incentive was growing much more rapidly, and that's obviously a factor of the stock market doing well, especially for employees in public companies. And I think what you're going to, I know you're going to see, because we already are starting to see it, is that the overall value of those are going to start to go down just because stock prices are going down, and companies are not going to be necessarily interested in further diluting their share or option pools just because it's that would make things even go lower. But I think what's happening is that despite the fact that you'll see long-term incentive awards having lower values with what's going on, the recruiting mechanism around that is that yes, that we're providing you with a long-term incentive value that is lower, but the upside when things start to turn around again will have a rebound, and you'll see some nice gains, hopefully. So I think that's where you're going to definitely be seeing a drop in the overall valuation of long-term incentives, but again, let's just hope it's temporary. So.
Yeah, I see that you have a question. Whether I have benchmarking data from a third-party provider, can I implement it into Bob? So yes, of course you can. We have a partnership with Mercer, and we see the value in the data, as Roger mentioned, and there is a value of the data existing within Bob. What we are obviously not preventing you from uploading any benchmarking data that you can use. The same method that I use, that I show in Excel, can be implemented on any other benchmark provider and can be implemented in Bob in the same way. And once we release the bands, we will also support it and we'll be agnostic to the vendors. We don't want to limit you, our clients, to a specific vendor. We do offer you a very easy and quick way to get the data from within Bob with Mercer, but we are not limiting you to these options only. Roger, anything we want to add to conclude this very interesting talk? I have to say, I learned a lot.
I'm just thinking of some of the notes that I had taken down. One of the other things that, in terms of trends that we started to hear this happening, I don't know, maybe 5 or 7 years ago, was a trend of companies starting to get rid of performance ratings. And the idea that, and it is oftentimes for people a kind of an awkward, time, and it's also a very laborious process. I mean, it takes a lot of time to get this done, and so some companies thought that by getting rid of it, it would maybe take some of the pressure off, and that it would encourage more regular interaction between managers and employees. That was, kind of the idea. Still, what we noticed in 2021, there were 2/3 of our participants still had a formal, salary review program. And actually, in the data that we're just about to publish, that figure went up. So it's gone from 66% to 70% of organizations with a performance rating program in place. Because I would say this, even though employers might have gotten rid of the formal performance rating program, it's not that they still don't know. They still know who the top performers are. It's just it's not as made as public, because we collect that as part of our data as well. So it's just, that was kind of an interesting trend, but maybe it looks like it's starting to come back the other way a little bit.
Fade away. Yeah, it's starting to fade away, and I think it's related to the market, basically, because the market is changing, and we see as all the topics that we already talked about. So maybe this is a counter trend for that trend in a way. I think that people ask about the value, and I think it's I think the best way to conclude this webinar is to emphasize about the value of the benchmarking data. I think the benchmarking data give us the confidence on the compensation we are giving our employees, and giving us the confidence that what we are giving them is enough. It's helping us keeping the competitive edge that we are all looking for, and giving us control over it. And I think, speaking about the visibility trend, this is the fundamental, the first building block that we need to do in order to achieve this visibility in the long run. And we think, and we see that this visibility is no longer an option. It's something that becomes mandatory, and we need to start addressing it now, because when it will become mandatory in our sites, it will be a bit too late for that. So I think eventually this is the fundamental step that companies need to take in order to start gaining this confidence and creating this visibility. Question about historical data. The data is updated within Bob every quarterly. So we don't have access to historical data, but if you want access to historical data, you can contact CS, and I'm sure that we can help you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I had the pleasure of speaking to you. Thank you, Roger.
No, thank you.
It was very insightful. And hope to see you soon on another webinar of ours. Thank you so much.
Great.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye.